Hi, and welcome to another episode of Starship Gaming. And today we are going to discuss the Game Boy. Specifically, we're going to discuss the subject of whether Game Boy games are really worth collecting. So, let's discuss. So, of course, the Game Boy was released first in 1989, but for many years, the Game Boy itself was a staple of portable gaming, and it set the standard and eventually evolved into what we have now, which of course now we have the Nintendo Switch, and it also inspired dozens of other companies to come up with their own handheld version, including such failed ones as the Sega Game Gear, which, let's admit it, the Sega Game Gear was never a success. Of course, you had the Sega Nomad, which was a worse handheld than the Game Gear itself, even though it was 16-bit and played Sega Genesis games on the go. Cool concept, but never really was that plausible or feasible or whatever the word for that is. It just wasn't a good idea. And then, of course, you had the PSP, which was a moderate success, never quite as successful as the Game Boy Advance or the Nintendo DS, but it received a pretty well, I guess you could say a pretty well following from dedicated fans. And then eventually we got the PS Vita, which never was very popular at all, at least from what I could remember. And of course, you had the DS era, 3DS, but today we're just going to discuss the Game Boy era and whether Game Boy games are really actually worth collecting. So when we look at the original Game Boy, it had a pretty decent library of games. I mean, there were literally tons of games for the original Game Boy. And of course, it had an early start in the portable handheld market by several years from its competition. Of course, their competition, like Sega Game Gear, pretty much copied the concept but tried to improve upon it with color and whatnot, but we'll get there eventually. But it had a huge library. There were literally tons and tons of games for the original Game Boy that you could buy. And the thing about the Game Boy is that it kind of introduced adults to the gaming craze. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the picture of Hillary Clinton sitting on a plane playing a Game Boy. I mean, adults were actually buying Game Boys for the first time. Well, they actually were buying games for the first time for themselves, like Tetris. And businessmen and businesswomen were buying them and actually playing them. So it really revolutionized not only handheld gaming, but I think it had a lot to do with the revolution we've had today with cell phones. With games being on our phones and whatnot. The Game Boy was the start of it all. Now, like I said, there was quite a few Game Boy games, and quite a few of them are collectible. Like, for example, well, I should say the best example was Pokemon Red and Blue when they released. Highly collectible today. They don't go for a whole lot, typically $15 to $20, but if you collect games, you should at least have a copy of each one in your collection. And then, of course, we later got Yellow, which came out in '99 in the US. And then, of course, some of the last Game Boy games, well, I should say last games that would work on the Game Boy, even though they were kind of targeted for the Game Boy Color, was Pokemon Gold and Silver, which, in case you didn't know that, yes, you can play Gold and Silver on an original Game Boy. It was one of the last ones I believe it was one of the last ones. And interesting enough, I have a Super Game Boy at home. I have a Game Boy Advance, but let's face it, who wants to sit and stare at a screen, especially an adult, sit and stare at a screen all day? When you have a Super Game Boy cartridge for your Super Nintendo, you can put it in and play Pokemon Gold or Silver, or any of them pre-Gold and Silver for that matter, and play it on your TV screen. That's what I do. I have Pokemon Gold, and I play it on my Super Game Boy cartridge all the time. And of course, that's another one that's pretty collectible. If you have a Super Nintendo, you must have a Super Game Boy, and you must have at least minimum 10 Game Boy games to play on it. Minimum. So, the next one we're going to discuss is the Game Boy Color, which came out in the United States in 1998. Now, I didn't own one until Christmas of 2000, which I got to the party pretty late. But my parents went to an Ames department store and bought me a Game Boy Color back in like 2000. My friend had one. He had a Game Boy Color. I used to play it all the time. He had actually the yellow one shown in the picture. The one I owned was Atomic Purple, which, you know, is probably the reason why I like the whole concept of the Atomic Purple kind of deal, see-through kind of plastic, you know. But at the time, that was a really cool concept. And of course, the cartridges, you could see through them too. Now, the Game Boy Color had quite a few collectible titles, not only for the fact that a lot of the games received limited releases in some cases, or just weren't popular at all. The prices of them have been going up over the years. And the good thing about the Game Boy Color itself was it was backwards compatible with the entire original Game Boy library, except it came in color. Now, the one thing that annoyed me about the Game Boy Color, there was no backlight, so you had to buy one of those weird lights to go on it. I remember going to Toys R Us in 2001, and they had a bunch of these. They called them squishy lights. They looked like they were kind of squishy rubber, but they looked like slime with an eyeball, and the eyeball was supposed to be a light that beamed down on your screen to light it up. I remember hitting up a Toys R Us in 2001. They had some in a bargain bin for like $9.99, which I'm pretty sure that wasn't too much off the price of what they originally cost. I would say probably originally maybe $19.99, $29.99, I'm not sure. But I ended up getting one for my Atomic Purple Game Boy Color. And what's funny is it's weird talking about stores that are defunct. Like a minute ago I mentioned Ames. I used to go there and get Game Boy games all the time. My very first Game Boy game was Clax. Well, I should say my first Game Boy Color game. I never, got too into Game Boy, but whatever. Clax was my first Game Boy Color game. And I really did, I did enjoy it. Tetris I never could get the hang of. I was never a big Tetris fan until I got older, until I was like 15, 16 years old. But Clax was my first one, and then of course I bought everyone's like Pokemon Yellow, and of course it was original Game Boy, but it was around that time. But the games for Game Boy Color, they're moderately collectible. It just depends on which ones you want to collect, because there was a lot of like filler material, I guess you could say. Some of the games were pretty decent, some of them just weren't. But it really depended on what your type of games that you liked were worth buying. So eventually, and I know there's a bunch of other Game Boys in this picture you see on screen, but the Game Boy Advance was released in 2001, even though Game Boy Color games continued to be made, I believe, up until 2003. I'm pretty sure. But of course, Game Boy Advance came on the scene. The original model, of course, it was popular. It was a popular toy. Well, not really a toy, but, well, for kids it was like a toy, but it was a popular handheld for Christmas 2001. I remember my cousin got one for Christmas. Like the year before, she ended up getting a Game Boy Color. And then the next year, her dad bought her a Game Boy Advance, and I was like, what are you going to do with your Game Boy Color? And she was just like, oh, it's trash now. I threw it away. I'm like, what? You could have gave it to me. But anyway, the Game Boy Advance came out, and there were a ton of games for the Game Boy Advance. And it was like the original Game Boy. It was like the big revival of handhelds. When Game Boy Color came out, the whole handheld thing kind of lulled there for a few years. The only ones that kids were really playing were Pokemon. You know, there were a couple others, but it kind of lulled. It wasn't really, no other game was really selling other than Pokemon. I mean, yeah, there were plenty that sold, but not to the level of before, I should say. So, the Game Boy Advance, of course, its big titles were stuff like Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Of course, you had Emerald. The Pokemon games, when you look at Game Boy history, the Pokemon games were almost always number one, if they weren't always number one in terms of sellers. Of course, you had a lot of good titles like, you know, Super Mario Advance, Super Mario Advance 2, Super Mario World, stuff like that. Really sold well. And I remember this was around the time when I really started getting into handheld gaming. Of course, I had a subscription to Nintendo Power in the early 2000s. I subscribed between, it was the middle period between Nintendo 64, Game Boy Color, and GameCube, Game Boy Advance. So it was between that time. And then, of course, the one I owned growing up was the Game Boy Advance SP, which I had a red one. I got mine for Christmas in 2003. And, of course, I had Ruby and Sapphire. And, of course, my mom went to a local pawn shop and bought me a couple Game Boy Color games because I told her they were backwards compatible. And one of them was Pokemon Silver. The SP was really a game changer because it was the first Game Boy, you know, Game Boy Advance, I should say. They have a backlit screen. But, you know, for the Game Boy Advance, it was the first time that I ever seen one with a backlit screen. And that was a pretty amazing concept for, you know, maybe 6 months compared to, you know, living with a Game Boy Color for 3 years at that point. So it was really a real upgrade. So the overall question that you really came here to hear is whether Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games are really worth collecting. Well, the answer to that is yes. There are quite a few really great titles for all three of those handhelds that you can get. And I also forgot to mention the Game Boy Micro, which really, to be honest, is only good for a collector, but not really worth buying to play. So, yeah. Game Boy games, they just had a lot of variety. It's kind of like, you can compare them to the NES and the SNES. There was just so much variety you could play, and the good thing is, you could play, on the Game Boy Advance, you could play all of them from the previous generation. Like, yeah. So my advice, and this is from a true collector and gamer, if you're going to buy a Game Boy just to play Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games, I recommend getting a Game Boy Advance SP. It is probably the single best choice that you could make if you want to play all the games from the previous generations. And of course, you can go to your local games, store and find all kinds of great Game Boy games. Like I said, if you haven't watched my videos in the past, I've said I run a game store. I have a pretty large selection of Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games. Not so much really Game Boy Color, mostly because people, for some reason, they really like Game Boy Color games in my area. Not quite sure why. But try out your local game shop. The prices on them can vary. Common titles don't pay more than $5. Stuff like Pokemon, depending on which one it is, you could safely pay up to $30 and, and not feel too ripped off, depending on condition. Condition's everything. If they have a poor copy of Pokemon, like the label ripped and everything, don't pay more than $10 unless you really, really wanted that copy. I think the most collectible game that I've sold recently, like in the past year, was a Captain America game for Game Boy, and I sold that copy for $50. And this was like during the height of, you know, pre-Endgame, pretty much. Like, everybody was buying up everything Marvel, and the prices of Marvel games just skyrocketed. I think that's probably the most in the past year that I've sold one for. So, yeah, they're pretty collectible. But like I said, check out your local game store. Check out pawn shops. There's certain pawn shops that carry Game Boy games, you know, depending on your taste in Game Boy games, your personal whatever. And of course, check out thrift stores. Quite a few thrift stores like Goodwill and other places, they'll carry them. You know, check out flea markets and of course yard sales. Well, of course, at the recording of this video, unless you live in a warm climate, anywhere warm in North America, then you're probably not going to encounter a yard sale at this time of year. As of the recording of this video, it's November, specifically November 2019. And it's going to be kind of hard to find games this time of year. I know it's hard for me. I have to hit up a lot of flea markets, like indoor flea markets, sometimes occasionally outdoor, because you'll have people right before Christmas that need the money, and they'll sell their stuff super cheap to get that cash, you know. So I'd say, you know, give it a try. It might be worth your time. Game Boy collecting, I mean, there's an extensive amount. I only recommend collecting Game Boy games if you really want to take the time to do it, because it is time consuming. You could literally spend a decade collecting every single title, if not more, 15 years collecting every single title for Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. It's just that extensive. So, you know, just a little heads up before you start collecting them. But it is rewarding. You'll have a fun time, and you'll feel really good about collecting them. Just make sure you have a good way to store them, and a good way if you're going to display them in your home. I recommend, they do sell these cabinets. They used to sell them for like stores, retail stores, that you can display Game Boy games, like the individual ones. You can buy those mostly online. You might find them occasionally at a yard sale or flea market. They're stand-up cases. Or you could just use a display case. That's if you want to display them. If not, the best way to store them is in an old shoebox. Honestly, an old shoebox will keep the dust off of them, keep them pristine. Just keep them at room temperature on a shelf somewhere. That's the best way to store them, in all honesty. So, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out if you do. It helps us grow. It helps me want to keep making more videos. It keeps me from being depressed. Hit the bell to get notifications of when we make more awesome videos. And until next time, I will see ya.